Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. I always counted the chimes. Every afternoon, 3 precisely spaced bell tolls echoed, marking the hour. It was like a metronome in my day, a soft anchor I never questioned. Last Tuesday, the second chime seemed to hesitate, stretching just a fraction longer than it should. By Thursday, it was undeniably out of step, an odd pause where none belonged. Today, only 2 chimes resonated before silence fell. Oddly, the clock faces the same way as always, but now I wonder if I've overlooked something crucial. The clock face. The brass numerals catch afternoon light differently now. Where 12 once stood proud at the top, there's a subtle tarnish that wasn't there before. The minute hand trembles slightly at the quarter hour, a nervous tick I never noticed during all those months of routine observation. The pendulum swings with the same steady rhythm, yet something feels fundamentally altered. When I press my ear against the wooden case, the internal mechanism whispers secrets in a language of springs and gears. The sound reminds me of breathing shallow, irregular breathing that doesn't quite match the visual cadence of the pendulum's arc. The dust pattern asterisk. Someone has been here. The mantelpiece holds evidence in microscopic detail. Finger smudges where the clock was lifted, shifted, then replaced with imperfect precision. The dust forms a ghostly outline, a shadow of where the base once sat. The pattern suggests careful handling, deliberate movement, not the hasty grab of a burglar, but the methodical touch of someone who understood the importance of returning everything to its proper place. Almost proper. The deviation measures perhaps an inch, maybe less, enough to disrupt the acoustic properties that carried those chimes through the house with such reliable consistency. The key asterisk. It sits in the small wooden drawer beneath the clock, exactly where it always rested. Brass ornate with teeth worn smooth by decades of weekly winding. But the metal feels different against my fingertips, now warmer somehow, as if recently handled. When I lift it to the light, there are microscopic scratches on the shaft that I don't remember seeing before. Fresh scratches. The kind that appear when someone unfamiliar with the mechanism forces the key slightly askew while winding. My hands know this key intimately after months of maintenance. These marks tell a story of foreign fingers, uncertain pressure, hasty work. The winding hole. The brass opening shows similar evidence of inexpert handling. Tiny scratches radiate from the keyhole like sunbeams, marking where an unfamiliar hand missed the precise alignment required. I've wound this clock every Sunday for months, developing a muscle memory that slides the key home without conscious thought. These marks speak of someone learning the motion, perhaps in darkness or under pressure. The scratches are fresh enough to catch light differently than the surrounding metal, creating tiny shadows that shift as I move my head. The silence asterisk. Between the second and missing third chime lies a void that feels almost physical. The house seems to hold its breath during those moments when the final toll should resonate. The absence creates a different kind of sound, not quiet, but wrong quiet, like a song with a missing note that throws the entire melody into question. The silence has weight, pressing against my eardrums with expectations unfulfilled. It makes me realize how much I depended on that third chime to release the tension built by the first 2. Without it, the sequence feels perpetually unfinished. The window. From where I stand beside the clock, I can see the garden through glass that needs cleaning. Handprints smudge the lower pane, small hands, child-sized, pressed against the glass from outside. The prints are recent enough to show clearly, but old enough to have collected a fine layer of dust around their edges. They're positioned at exactly the right height for someone to peer inside while standing on tiptoes. The angle suggests the observer was trying to see the clock, watching its face from the garden. Watching and waiting for something specific. The carpet asterisk. Footprints indent the thick pile in patterns that don't match my usual movement around the room. The impressions are subtle, visible only when light hits the fibers at the right angle. Someone stood here for an extended period, shifting weight from foot to foot in the way people do when concentrating on a delicate task. The deepest impressions cluster around the mantelpiece, with lighter marks trailing toward the window and back. The pattern suggests someone working while periodically checking the view outside. Or watching for someone's approach. The photograph asterisk. On the side table, a framed picture sits at a slightly different angle than I remember. The silver frame reflects light in a way that creates a blind spot where none existed before. Inside the frame, faces smile with the frozen permanence of captured time. But now the glass catches my reflection as I move past, superimposing my face over the figures in the photograph. The effect is disorienting, creating a double exposure of past and present that makes me question which image belongs to which moment. The cushion. The chair beside the clock bears the impression of recent occupation. The velvet cushion holds the memory of weight, a shallow depression that hasn't had time to fully recover its shape. The fabric still radiates a faint warmth when I place my palm against it. Someone sat here recently, watching the clock, perhaps waiting for those chimes that now fail to complete their sequence. The angle of the chair provides a perfect view of both the clock face and the garden window, an ideal position for observation. The teacup. On the small table beside the chair, a porcelain cup sits empty but not quite clean. A thin residue rings the bottom, and the handle bears the faint impression of fingers. The cup is one from my own kitchen, part of a set I know intimately. But I have no memory of bringing tea to this room, no recollection of sitting in this chair to drink it. The saucer beneath shows water marks where the cup was lifted and replaced multiple times. The pattern suggests nervous sipping, distracted drinking while attention focused elsewhere. The floorboard asterisk. One plank creaks differently now when I step on it approaching the mantelpiece. The sound has changed pitch, become more pronounced. When I kneel to examine it closely, I notice the wood appears slightly raised at one end, as if someone heavier than usual had stood here repeatedly, gradually loosening the nails that hold it in place. The adjacent boards show similar but less pronounced signs of stress. The pattern radiates outward from the spot directly in front of the clock, suggesting focused activity in that precise location. The light switch. Fingerprints smudge the white plastic in configurations I don't recognize. My own hand knows this switch by muscle memory, always approaching from the same angle, always touching the same spot. These prints come from different angles, different hand sizes. Some are overlapped, suggesting multiple visits or extended periods of turning lights on and off. The switch plate itself sits slightly loose in its mounting, as if someone had removed and replaced it recently. Perhaps to access the wiring behind. The air. Something foreign lingers in the atmosphere of this room. Not quite a scent, more like the memory of one. It reminds me of outdoors brought inside earth, grass, the faint metallic smell of rain on concrete. But it hasn't rained recently, and the windows have remained closed. The smell seems concentrated near the clock, growing stronger when I lean close to examine the mechanism. It's the kind of scent that clings to clothing after spending time in a garden, kneeling in soil, handling plants with earth-stained fingers. The clock's interior asterisk. When I open the case to examine the mechanism, everything appears normal at first glance. The gears turn with their usual precision, the springs hold proper tension. But looking closer, I notice a small piece of paper wedged between two gears, not jamming them, but positioned where it would create subtle interference with the chiming mechanism. The paper is torn from something larger, blank on both sides, but folded with deliberate creases. When I remove it, the edges are soft with handling. Someone placed it there intentionally, knowing exactly how it would affect the clock's function. The realization asterisk. Standing here now, surrounded by these small alterations and subtle signs, I understand that every detail tells part of a larger story. Someone has been visiting this room, studying this clock, learning its rhythms and mechanisms. They knew enough to disable the third chime without stopping the clock entirely. They knew to be careful with the evidence, replacing everything almost exactly as they found it. Almost. The question that haunts me now isn't whether someone has been here, but why they wanted me to eventually notice. Why leave traces for me to find? Why alter the chimes in a way that would slowly draw my attention rather than escape it entirely? The clock continues its steady ticking, marking time towards some purpose I don't yet understand, while those missing third chimes echo in my memory like a countdown to something I cannot see. Story 2. The hallway carpet absorbed each step, muting what should have been the soft thud of soles. My fingers grazed the wall, anticipating the cool touch of paint, but only an indistinct warmth lingered. Objects appeared exactly as I left them, yet they resonated with a quiet unease. The familiar tap of the window latch was absent, a noise I hadn't realized accompanied my morning routine until it was gone. I reached for the light switch, feeling the click but witnessing no change in the room. The stillness around me seemed to hover, almost as if waiting for something to happen, or something that had already begun. The power had been cut, that much was certain, but the certainty ended there, dissolving into questions that multiplied like shadows in the dim light filtering through the blinds. I moved toward the kitchen, my hand trailing along the counter's edge. The coffee maker sat silent, its digital display blank. The refrigerator's hum had vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that felt almost tangible. I pulled open the refrigerator door and cool air brushed against my face. The interior light remained dark, but everything appeared undisturbed. Milk carton in its usual spot. Leftover container from dinner 2 nights ago. A half-empty bottle of wine I'd opened but never finished. Normal. Everything devastatingly normal except for the absence of sound, of light, of the electrical heartbeat that usually pulsed through the walls. The silence pressed against my eardrums. I found myself holding my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. Outside, a car door slammed. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp and immediate. I moved to the window and parted the blinds with 2 fingers. A sedan sat in the driveway across the street. Dark blue, maybe black, difficult to determine in the overcast morning light. I'd never seen it before, yet something about its presence felt inevitable. A woman emerged from the driver's side. Average height, brown coat, hair pulled back. She walked with purpose toward the house, her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too measured. I let the blinds fall back into place and stepped away from the window. The woman's footsteps had stopped. The silence returned, heavier now, weighted with possibility. My phone sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it. I pressed the power button and the screen illuminated, showing full battery and signal strength. The time displayed normally, though I noticed I'd been awake longer than I'd realized. I scrolled through my contacts, finger hovering over various names, but who would I call? What would I say? The power's out, and there's a woman I don't recognize visiting my neighbor. It sounded absurd even in my own mind. Instead, I opened my photo gallery, scrolling back through recent images. A picture from last week caught my attention. I'd taken it from this same kitchen window, capturing the morning light as it fell across the street. But in the photo, the house where the woman had gone was different. The shutters were blue, not the forest green I'd just observed. The front door was white, not the deep red I'd noticed moments ago. I looked up from the phone, then back at the image. Memory could be unreliable, I knew that, but photographs didn't lie. Or did they? I stared at the screen until the details began to blur, wondering if I was seeing what was actually there or what I expected to see. The sound of footsteps returned, but now they were moving away from the house across the street. I returned to the window. The woman was walking back toward her car, but her pace had changed. Where before she'd moved with confidence, now her steps seemed uncertain, almost hesitant. She paused beside the sedan, one hand on the door handle, and turned to look directly at my house. Even through the distance and the filtered light of the blinds, I felt the weight of her gaze. She stood there, motionless, for what felt like an extended moment. Then she got into her car and drove away, the engine's sound fading until only the silence remained. I realized I was gripping my phone tightly enough that my knuckles had gone white. I set it down and flexed my fingers, trying to understand why such an ordinary interaction had left me feeling unsettled. Neighbors had visitors. People looked at houses. These were normal occurrences that happened countless times every day in every neighborhood. But normal felt like a word that no longer applied. I decided to check the circuit breakers. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, each step producing a sound that seemed amplified in the electrical silence. The basement smelled different than usual, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Instead of the typical mustiness, there was something cleaner, almost sterile. The breaker box hung open. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the metal panel. The door swung gently on its hinges, as if it had been recently disturbed. All the breakers appeared to be in their correct positions, but several had been flipped off. I approached slowly, examining the switches. They'd been turned off systematically, not randomly, but in a pattern that suggested someone familiar with electrical systems. My hand trembled slightly as I began flipping the breakers back on. Each click echoed in the basement, followed by the gradual return of familiar sounds. The refrigerator's hum resumed upstairs. The heating system clicked to life. The normal electrical symphony of a functioning house began to play again. But who had been in my basement, and why? I climbed the stairs more quickly than I descended them. The house felt different with the power restored, but the sense of intrusion lingered. I walked through each room, looking for signs of disturbance, for anything out of place. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it, yet the feeling persisted that someone had been here, had moved through these spaces with purpose. In the living room, I noticed the television was on. I didn't remember turning it on, but perhaps it had been on when the power was cut and had resumed when electricity was restored. The volume was low, barely audible. A local news program was playing, the anchor's voice a soft murmur in the background. I reached for the remote to turn it off, but something in the anchor's words made me pause. Police are still investigating the disappearance, which occurred sometime during the overnight hours. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, but descriptions have been inconsistent. I turned up the volume. The anchor continued speaking, but the details were vague. Someone had gone missing from somewhere in the general area. No names were mentioned, no specific locations given. It was the kind of story that played on local news regularly, unfortunate but distant, tragic but not personally relevant. Except for the timing. I muted the television and sat down on the couch. The woman across the street, the car I'd never seen before, the systematic shutdown of my electrical system. These events could be unrelated, coincidental, or they could be connected in ways I couldn't yet understand. My phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for your cooperation." I stared at the message, reading it multiple times. Cooperation with what? I hadn't cooperated with anything or anyone. I typed back, "Who is this?" but the message failed to send. When I tried to call the number, I received a recording stating that it was no longer in service. I walked to the front door and checked the locks. Both the deadbolt and the handle lock were engaged just as I'd left them. But as I examined the door more closely, I noticed something that made my breath catch. There were fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, tiny metal shavings that caught the light. Someone had been inside my house. The realization settled over me like cold water. Someone had entered my home, disabled my electrical system, and left without taking anything or causing any obvious damage. But why? What had they been looking for? What had they found? I began searching more systematically, looking for anything that might be missing or altered. In the bedroom, my jewelry box sat undisturbed, valuable items still in place. My laptop remained on the desk, apparently untouched. Cash I kept in a kitchen drawer was still there, bills folded exactly as I'd left them. But in the study, I found something that didn't belong. A small digital recorder sat on the bookshelf, nestled between two volumes where it would be easily overlooked. It was sleek, modern, the kind of device that could record for hours without being detected. A tiny red light indicated it was still recording. I picked it up with shaking hands. The device was warm, as if it had been running for some time. I found the stop button and pressed it, and the red light went dark. Then I located the playback function. My own voice emerged from the tiny speaker, distorted but recognizable. I was talking to someone, but I couldn't remember the conversation. The recording was from this morning, based on the background sounds I could identify, but who was I talking to? "I understand," my voice said on the recording. "It needs to look natural." Another voice responded, too muffled to identify clearly, but distinctly female. The woman from across the street, I couldn't be certain. The basement access was easier than expected, my recorded voice continued. "No one will suspect anything." The recording ended there. I played it again, then a third time. Each playback left me more confused and disturbed. I had no memory of this conversation, no recollection of agreeing to anything or providing access to anyone. Yet there was my voice, apparently cooperating in some kind of deception. Had I been drugged? Was I experiencing some kind of memory loss? Or was the recording fabricated, my voice somehow manipulated to say things I'd never actually said? I thought about the woman I'd seen, her purposeful walk to the house across the street, the way she'd looked back at my house before leaving. Had she been signaling someone, confirming that something had been completed? The news report came back to me. Someone missing, unfamiliar vehicles, inconsistent descriptions from neighbors. I was a neighbor. I had seen an unfamiliar vehicle, but my description would be just as vague and unhelpful as the others mentioned in the report. Dark sedan, average-looking woman, normal morning activities that felt anything but normal. I returned to the window and looked across the street. The house appeared quiet, unchanged, but now I noticed details I'd missed before. The lawn was overgrown, as if it hadn't been maintained recently. Newspapers were stacked on the front step. The mailbox appeared to be overflowing. How long had it been since I'd actually seen the people who lived there? I tried to remember my neighbors, to recall recent interactions or even glimpses of them coming and going, but the memories were frustratingly vague. I knew someone lived there, but I couldn't conjure specific faces or names. In a neighborhood where people kept to themselves, it was possible to live across the street from someone for months without really seeing them. But if they were gone, if something had happened to them, then the woman's visit this morning took on a different significance. She hadn't been visiting neighbors, she'd been visiting an empty house. But why? I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my power had been mysteriously turned off, that I'd found a recording device in my study, that I'd seen a woman visit a house that might be empty. Even to me, it sounded like the paranoid imaginings of someone who'd watched too many crime shows. But the recording device was real. The scratches on my door were real. The conversation I couldn't remember was documented in my own voice. I decided to investigate the house across the street. I waited until the afternoon when the street was quiet and most people would be at work. I walked casually, as if I were simply taking a stroll around the neighborhood. When I reached the house, I could see that my observations from the window had been correct. The newspapers were dated from several weeks ago. The mail was indeed overflowing, and some had fallen to the ground. I walked up to the front door and knocked. No response. I tried again, listening carefully for any sounds from inside. Nothing. The windows were covered with curtains, making it impossible to see into the house. But as I walked around to the side yard, I found a window where the curtain had pulled away slightly from the frame. I peered through the gap. The interior was dark, but I could make out furniture covered with sheets. Moving boxes were stacked in the corner. It looked like someone had been in the process of moving out, but the job had been left unfinished. Or interrupted. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. If the neighbors had been moving, it would explain their absence. But it wouldn't explain why someone had been in their house this morning, or why my electrical system had been sabotaged, or why I'd apparently agreed to cooperate in something I couldn't remember. As I walked back toward my house, I noticed a car parked at the far end of the street, the same dark sedan I'd seen this morning. The woman was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me. I forced myself to continue walking at a normal pace, but every instinct screamed at me to run. When I reached my front door, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I could feel her eyes on me, tracking my movements. Once inside, I locked the door and went immediately to the window. The sedan was gone. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching online, trying to find any news reports about missing persons in the area, but the internet searches yielded nothing specific, just the same vague reports I'd heard on television. No names, no detailed descriptions, no specific locations. It was as if the story existed, but the details had been deliberately obscured. That evening I discovered something else. While going through my daily routine, I found a key in my pocket that I didn't recognize. It was small, brass, the kind that might fit a mailbox or a filing cabinet. I was certain it hadn't been there that morning. I examined it under the lamp, looking for any identifying marks or numbers. There were none, just a simple, anonymous key that somehow found its way into my possession. I tried to remember when I might have picked it up, but like so much else from this day, the memory was absent. Had someone placed it there? Had I taken it unconsciously from somewhere? The recording device still sat on my desk where I'd left it. I played the conversation again, listening more carefully this time. In the background, I could hear faint sounds that I'd missed before. The click of a lock, the rustle of papers, the soft thud of something being moved. Someone had been searching for something while I apparently provided access and cooperation. But what had they been looking for, and had they found it? I looked at the key again, turning it over in my palm. It was warm from my touch, but it felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt like evidence of something I'd participated in but couldn't remember, something that connected me to events I didn't understand. As night fell, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything else. I moved restlessly through the house, checking and rechecking the locks, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The familiar creaks and settling noises of the house seemed amplified, each one a potential threat. I tried to piece together a timeline of the day's events, but the sequence felt fragmented, like a puzzle with missing pieces. The power outage, the woman's visit across the street, the recording device, the key in my pocket, each element seemed significant, but I couldn't determine how they connected. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed the same unknown number that had sent the text message earlier. I let it go to voicemail, but when I played the message, there was only silence followed by the soft click of disconnection. I was being watched, monitored, perhaps manipulated in ways I was only beginning to understand. The question that haunted me as I prepared for bed was not just what had happened, but what role I had played in it. The recording suggested I had been a willing participant, but my lack of memory indicated something else entirely. Had I been coerced, threatened, or was there a part of me that had agreed to something terrible and then blocked it from conscious memory? I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the key clutched in my hand. Somewhere across the street, an empty house held secrets I might never understand. Somewhere in my own memory, there were gaps that might never be filled. And somewhere in the space between what I knew and what I suspected, the truth waited in shadows that seemed determined never to lift. The silence that had begun the day continued into the night, but now it felt different. Not waiting for something to happen, but concealing something that already had. Story 3. It felt like the faint click of a knob turning, deliberate yet almost tentative, breaking the delicate silence of the empty room. I hesitated by the old armchair, its fabric worn and familiar under my fingers. The sound repeated, echoing faintly from the corridor that led to a room I'd sealed long ago. Every instinct whispered that it was just the wind, but I'd told myself the same on nights when the locks had been secure and the air still. The curtains moved imperceptibly, a breeze where none should be. That click hadn't resurfaced since everything changed, and ignoring it wouldn't make it fade. The armchair holds the impression of someone who sat there often, the cushion permanently molded to accommodate a particular weight and posture. The burgundy fabric has faded to rust in patches where elbows rested, where hands gripped the arms during moments of tension or contemplation. I remember purchasing it together, how we debated between this one and a sleeker model. The decision seemed so important then, as if choosing the right chair would somehow anchor our future in place. Now the empty impression feels like an accusation, a hollow space that refuses to forget its purpose. The brass doorknob at the end of the corridor gleams despite months of neglect. I polished it religiously once, every week without fail, until it caught the morning light and threw it back in warm, golden circles on the wall. The metal remembers the touch of different hands, mine, careful and methodical, and others that turned it with varying degrees of urgency or hesitation. Sometimes I would hear it turning in the middle of the night and assume it was just the house settling, the way old homes breathe and shift in the darkness. But brass doesn't turn itself, no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise. The sealed room beyond that door contains a desk positioned precisely beneath the window, angled to catch the afternoon light. Papers still scatter its surface, held down by a paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat. The handwriting on those documents shifts between careful script and hurried scrawl, as if the writer's mood changed with each line. I used to bring coffee there every morning, setting it on the small, clear space beside the lamp. The ring stains remain, overlapping circles that mark time in their own quiet way. Some mornings the coffee would sit untouched until it grew cold, and I learned not to ask why. The floorboards in the corridor creak in a specific pattern, a musical sequence that announces anyone's approach long before they reach the door. I memorized that rhythm, could distinguish between different gates and intentions just by listening. Quick, light steps meant excitement or urgency. Slow, deliberate ones suggested deep thought or reluctance. But sometimes I heard footsteps that didn't match any pattern I recognized, steps that seemed to pause at irregular intervals, as if someone was stopping to examine things along the way. I convinced myself I was imagining the unfamiliar rhythms. The window in the sealed room faces the garden, where rose bushes grow in neat rows that someone once tended with obsessive care. Each bush was pruned to exact specifications, the spacing measured and remeasured until it achieved geometric perfection. The roses bloomed in cycles I learned to predict, their colors rotating through the seasons in a carefully planned sequence. But now they grow wild, their branches reaching toward the window like fingers seeking entry. Sometimes I catch myself watching for movement among the thorns, expecting to see someone nailing there with pruning shears. The lamp on the desk has a green glass shade that casts everything beneath it in an underwater glow. Late at night, that light would spill under the door and into the corridor, a thin line of green that told me someone was still working. I found comfort in that light, the way it suggested purpose and productivity. But there were nights when the light remained on until dawn, and I would find the room empty in the morning, the chair pushed back as if someone had left in a hurry. The papers would be rearranged, sometimes torn, and I learned not to ask about the changes. The coffee cup that sits permanently on the desk bears a small chip on its rim, a flaw that developed gradually over months of use. I remember when it first appeared, a tiny imperfection that seemed to grow larger each time I noticed it. The cup was part of a set we received as a gift, 12 matching pieces that gradually dwindled as accidents claimed them one by one. This cup survived longer than the others, perhaps because it was used so frequently, held with such care. Now the chip catches my eye every time I look at it, a small wound that refuses to heal. The key to the sealed room hangs on a hook just inside the kitchen, where I placed it after turning the lock for the final time. The metal has grown cold, untouched for so long that it feels foreign in my palm when I occasionally test its weight. I tell myself I keep it there for practical reasons, that every room should have an accessible key. But sometimes I find myself standing in the kitchen, staring at that hook, wondering if the key has moved slightly from where I left it. The scratches around the keyhole seem more pronounced now, as if someone has been practicing with it in my absence. The curtains throughout the house move with their own logic, responding to air currents I cannot detect. They billow and settle in patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if controlled by an invisible hand. I replaced the old curtains after everything changed, choosing heavier fabric that would hang still and straight. But even these new ones shift and sway, particularly near the sealed room, where they flutter against the window like trapped birds. I have checked for drafts, sealed every gap I can find, but still they move. The telephone in the kitchen rings at irregular intervals, but when I answer, I hear only silence or the distant sound of breathing. The calls always come when I am alone, never when visitors are present. I have considered changing the number, but something stops me each time I reach for the phone book. Perhaps it is hope, or perhaps it is fear of what the silence might mean. The receiver grows warm against my ear as I listen, waiting for words that never come. Sometimes I think I hear familiar sounds in the background, the creak of that particular floorboard, the whisper of papers being shuffled. The mirror in the hallway reflects the corridor that leads to the sealed room, creating a doubled perspective that sometimes confuses my sense of direction. I catch glimpses of movement in its surface, shadows that seem to shift independently of any light source. When I turn to look directly down the corridor, I see nothing unusual, but the mirror continues to show subtle changes, a door that appears slightly more open, a shadow that falls at a different angle. I have considered removing the mirror, but it has hung in that spot for so long that the wall behind it has faded to a different shade. The heating system produces sounds that travel through the walls like whispered conversations. Pipes tick and murmur, carrying messages I cannot decode but somehow recognize. The rhythm changes depending on the weather, becoming more insistent during storms, more subtle on calm nights. But lately the sounds seem to originate from areas where no pipes run, particularly near the sealed room. I have called repair services, but they find nothing wrong with the system. They suggest the house is simply old, that old houses make noise, but I know the difference between settling and something else. The garden gate clicks in the wind, its latch worn smooth by years of use. I oil the hinges regularly, but the click persists, a sharp sound that cuts through other ambient noise. Sometimes the clicking comes in patterns that seem almost like code, short bursts followed by longer pauses. I have watched from the window, but the gate appears stationary even when the sound is most pronounced. The metal shows no signs of recent use, no fingerprints or scratches that would indicate someone has been opening and closing it. Yet the clicking continues, particularly at night. The photographs on the mantelpiece have been rearranged subtly over the months, shifted by degrees so small that I almost convince myself I am imagining the changes. Faces that once smiled directly at the camera now seem to look slightly to the side, as if distracted by something beyond the frame. The glass covering each photo bears fingerprints that reappear no matter how often I clean them. I have memorized the exact position of each frame, but still, I find small discrepancies that make me question my own memory. The locked drawer in the kitchen sticks when I try to open it, as if something inside has shifted and now blocks the mechanism. I remember placing important documents there, papers that seemed significant at the time but now feel like relics from another life. The key turns easily, but the drawer resists, and when I finally force it open, the contents appear disturbed. Papers that were once neatly stacked now lie at odd angles, and sometimes I find items I do not remember storing there, a pen I thought I had lost, a receipt with handwriting that looks familiar but wrong. The basement door remains locked, but sometimes I hear sounds from below that suggest movement. Footsteps cross the concrete floor in measured intervals, pausing at locations I remember marking for different purposes. Storage boxes shift and settle, but the sounds are too regular, too purposeful to be random. I tell myself that basements accumulate noise from the rest of the house, that sounds travel through wood and stone in unpredictable ways. But when I place my ear against the door, the footsteps seem to approach from directly below, as if someone knows I am listening. The wind chimes on the back porch sing in harmonies that change with the seasons, but lately their music has taken on a different quality. The tones seem more urgent, more insistent, particularly when no breeze stirs the air. I have counted the chimes repeatedly, ensuring that none have been added or removed, but their song suggests additional voices, phantom notes that blend with the familiar melody. Sometimes I wake to the sound of chimes in the middle of the night, when the air is perfectly still and no wind should reach them. The clock in the sealed room stopped at a specific time, its hands frozen in a position that once held significance. I wound it regularly, maintained its rhythm as faithfully as I maintained everything else in that space. But now it sits silent, its face reflecting the green light from the desk lamp in a way that makes the numbers appear to shift and blur. Time seems suspended in that room, held in place by the stopped clock and the accumulated weight of unchanged air. Sometimes I imagine I can hear it ticking through the locked door, keeping time in a world that no longer moves forward. The final click echoes from the corridor as I sit in the worn armchair, my fingers tracing the familiar fabric. The sound is clearer now, more distinct, as if whatever has been turning that brass knob has finally found the courage to complete the motion. I do not turn toward the corridor, do not acknowledge what I know I will find when I finally choose to look. The impression in the cushion beside me seems deeper now, more recent, as if someone has just risen and walked away. The house holds its breath, waiting for me to decide whether this moment calls for fear or relief. Story 4. The switch didn't click beneath my finger. I moved through the dim hallway, my steps absorbed by the carpet that refused to echo back. A draft lingered without a source as I brushed past the frames on the wall, each tilt seeming deliberate yet untouched. The air felt dense, charged with an expectancy that never arrived. Reaching the kitchen, I paused, gazing at the open cupboard that should have grown closed. I reached out, only for the door to stop inches before my palm, as if obeying an unseen force. It was the absence itself that felt heavy, as though something was keeping watch. I knew what had happened here. The facts were simple, clean, undeniable. My sister had taken her own life in this house 3 weeks ago. The police report spelled it out in black ink on white paper. The detective had been thorough, methodical. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. The medicine cabinet emptied, the bottle found beside her bed, a note in her handwriting, clear as daylight. I'd come back to pack her things to close this chapter. The landlord needed the apartment cleared, and I was the only family left to handle it. Simple as that. The electrical problems were just old wiring. The house was built in the 60s, and the previous tenant had mentioned issues with the switches. The landlord had promised to fix them, but never got around to it. My sister had complained about it too in one of our last phone conversations. The lights would flicker, sometimes not turn on at all. Nothing mysterious about faulty circuits. I moved through her living room, boxing up books and photographs. Everything felt normal, expected. The coffee mug still sat on the side table where she'd left it, a ring of dried liquid at the bottom. Her reading glasses folded neatly beside the lamp. These were the artifacts of an ordinary life interrupted. The cupboard door in the kitchen had always been broken. The hinges were loose, and it would swing open on its own. She'd mentioned it during one of our calls, laughing about how she'd walk into the kitchen and find it gaping open like a mouth. We joked about getting her a screwdriver, about me coming over to fix it. But I'd been busy with work, with my own problems. There was always next weekend, always later. I folded her clothes methodically, placing them in donation bags. Her sweaters still held the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and light. The detective had been kind but direct. Cases like this were more common than people realized. The signs had been there, he'd explained. The isolation, the recent job loss, the breakup with her boyfriend the month before, a perfect storm of circumstances. But as I worked, something nagged at me, a detail that didn't quite fit. The note, I'd read it once quickly when the detective showed it to me. It was brief, apologetic, written in her familiar handwriting on a piece of her personal stationery. But thinking back now, something about it felt wrong. Not the words themselves, but something else. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I found myself standing in her bedroom doorway, staring at the bed where they'd found her. The sheets had been changed, the room cleaned by a service the landlord had hired, but I could still picture the scene the detective had described. She'd been lying peacefully, he'd said, no signs of distress, like she'd simply gone to sleep. My sister had always been a restless sleeper. Even as children, I'd wake to find her tangled in her sheets, pillows on the floor. She moved constantly in her sleep, fighting invisible battles. The idea of her lying still, peaceful, seemed foreign to everything I knew about her. I walked to her dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside were the usual things, jewelry, hair ties, old letters. But underneath I found something that made me pause, a prescription bottle nearly full. The same medication they'd found empty beside her bed. The dates on the labels were identical. 2 bottles of the same prescription filled on the same day. One empty, one nearly full. I sat on the edge of her bed, holding both bottles. The detective had said she'd taken the entire contents of the bottle. But if there were 2 bottles, why had only one been found? Why was this one still here, hidden in her drawer? The room felt different now, charged with questions I hadn't thought to ask before. I looked around with new eyes, searching for other details I might have missed. The window was open slightly, something I hadn't noticed before. My sister hated sleeping with windows open. She was always cold, always pulling on sweaters and wrapping herself in blankets. I called the detective's office. He was patient with my questions, professional but slightly distant. Yes, they'd found one empty prescription bottle. No, they hadn't searched extensively through her personal belongings. The scene had been straightforward, the cause of death clear. Sometimes, he explained gently, family members look for complications that aren't there. It's a natural part of grief. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started going through her things more carefully, looking for anything else that seemed out of place. In her purse, I found her phone. The battery was dead, but when I charged it and turned it on, I discovered something strange. The last call in her history wasn't outgoing as I'd expected. It was incoming, received just hours before she died. The number wasn't in her contacts. I called the number. It rang twice before a man answered. His voice was unfamiliar, cautious when I explained who I was. He said he was sorry for my loss, but claimed he didn't know my sister well. They'd met at a coffee shop, he said. She'd seemed upset about something, and he'd given her his number in case she needed someone to talk to. She'd called him that night, crying incoherent. He'd offered to come over, but she'd hung up. His story sounded reasonable, but something in his tone bothered me. He was too careful with his words, too quick to explain away their connection. When I asked which coffee shop, he became vague. When I asked what she'd been upset about, he said he couldn't remember clearly. I hung up feeling more unsettled than before. That night I decided to stay in her apartment. I told myself it was practical, I had more packing to do, and it would save me the drive back in the morning. But really, I needed to be there to feel what she'd felt in her final days. The electrical problems were worse than I'd initially noticed. Lights would flicker on and off randomly. The refrigerator would hum loudly, then fall silent. The cupboard door in the kitchen kept swinging open, no matter how firmly I closed it. But these weren't mysterious phenomena. They were the signs of a building in disrepair, a landlord who cut corners. Weren't they? I lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of traffic. I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there, watching shadows that didn't move. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the apartment, slow, deliberate steps that paused outside the door. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps continued, fading away. Just another tenant returning home late. But the feeling of being watched remained. I thought about my sister's last weeks, trying to piece together her state of mind. She'd lost her job, yes, but she'd been optimistic about finding something new. The breakup had been difficult, but she'd seemed to be handling it well. We talked regularly, and while she'd sounded tired, she hadn't seemed desperate or hopeless. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was missing from the official story. But what, and why hadn't the police seen it? The next morning, I called my sister's former boyfriend. We'd never been close, but he agreed to meet me for coffee. He was a quiet man, soft-spoken and nervous. When I asked about their breakup, he became uncomfortable. It hadn't been his choice, he admitted. She'd ended things suddenly, claiming she needed space. But he'd gotten the impression she was scared of something, though she wouldn't tell him what. She kept looking over her shoulder, he said, like she expected someone to be following her. I asked her about it, but she just laughed it off, said she was being paranoid. Had she mentioned feeling unsafe? I asked. He nodded slowly. She'd started locking her door all the time, even when she was home, and she'd call me late at night sometimes, just to have someone on the phone while she fell asleep. Said the apartment felt too quiet. This wasn't the behavior of someone planning to take her own life. This was the behavior of someone who was afraid. I went back to the apartment with new purpose. If my sister had been scared, there had to be evidence of why. I searched more thoroughly this time, looking for anything that might explain her fear. In a box under her bed, I found a stack of photographs. Most were ordinary friends, family gatherings, vacation snapshots, but several were different. They showed the outside of her apartment building, taken from across the street. The angle suggested they'd been shot from a car window. In one, I could make out a figure in her apartment window. The figure was too distant to identify clearly, but the posture suggested someone looking out, watching. Why would my sister have photographs of someone watching her apartment? Had she taken them herself as evidence, or had someone else taken them and somehow left them for her to find? I studied the photos more closely. The lighting suggested they'd been taken at different times of day over a period of weeks. Someone had been watching her apartment regularly, systematically. I called the police again, asking to speak to the detective who'd handled my sister's case. When I described what I'd found, he listened politely but remained skeptical. The photos could have been taken by anyone for any reason. Maybe she'd been documenting problems with the building, or maybe they weren't even of her apartment. Without clearer evidence of a threat, there wasn't much they could do to reopen the case. But I knew what I'd seen. My sister had been afraid, and she'd had reason to be. I started spending more time at the apartment, hoping to see if anyone was still watching. I positioned myself by the window at different times, looking for signs of surveillance. For several days, I saw nothing unusual. Then on a rainy evening, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was an ordinary sedan, dark-colored, with tinted windows. It had been there for hours. I watched the car until well past midnight. It never moved. The next morning, it was gone. I began to feel the same paranoia my sister must have experienced. Every sound in the hallway made me tense. Every phone call from an unknown number felt threatening. I found myself checking the locks multiple times before bed, just as she had done. But was I uncovering the truth, or was I losing my grip on reality? The question haunted me as I continued to investigate. The more I learned, the less certain I became about what had really happened. The man who'd called her that night remained a mystery. When I tried calling his number again, it was disconnected. The photos proved someone had been watching, but not who or why. The second prescription bottle suggested the scene had been staged, but I couldn't prove it. I started to wonder if I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, finding mysteries in coincidences. Grief could play tricks on the mind. Maybe the detective had been right. Maybe I was looking for complications that weren't there. But then I found the journal. It was hidden behind a loose board in her bedroom closet, wrapped in plastic. The entry spanned several months, documenting a growing sense of unease. She wrote about feeling watched, about strange phone calls with no one on the other end, about items in her apartment being moved slightly when she was away. The final entry was dated the day before she died. In it, she wrote that she'd figured out who was watching her and why. She'd confronted him, she said. He denied everything, but she could see the truth in his eyes. She was going to the police in the morning. She never got the chance. I read the entry again, looking for any clue about the identity of her stalker. She referred to him only as he, never using a name. But there was something familiar about the behavior she described, something that nagged at the edges of my memory. The phone calls, the watching, the sense of being followed. I thought about everyone in my sister's life, everyone who might have had access to her apartment, who might have known her habits well enough to torment her so effectively. The boyfriend seemed unlikely. He genuinely cared for her, and his grief appeared real. Her coworkers barely knew her outside the office. The landlord was a possibility, but he was an elderly man who seemed more interested in collecting rent than in his tenants' personal lives. Then I remembered something, a conversation we'd had months earlier when she'd first moved into the apartment. She'd mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly in the middle of the night. The landlord had seemed nervous when she'd asked about it, deflecting her questions. She joked that maybe the apartment was haunted. What if the previous tenant hadn't left voluntarily? What if something had happened to make them flee? I tracked down the previous tenant through the post office forwarding address. She was a woman in her 30s, living now in a different part of the city. When I called and explained why I was contacting her, her reaction was immediate and intense. I knew something would happen, she said. I tried to warn the landlord, but he wouldn't listen. He just wanted the apartment filled. She agreed to meet me, but only in a public place during daylight hours. When I saw her, I understood her caution. She was thin, nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder. She looked like someone who'd been running for a long time. Her story was chilling. She'd lived in the apartment for nearly a year before the harassment began. At first it was subtle items moved, strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched. Then it escalated. Phone calls, letters slipped under her door, photos of herself taken without her knowledge. She'd gone to the police, but they'd been unable to help. No laws had been technically broken, they said. No direct threats had been made. It was harassment, but proving it was another matter. Finally, she'd had enough. She'd moved out in the middle of the night, forfeiting her security deposit and breaking her lease. She'd been too afraid to stay any longer. Who was doing it? I asked. She shook her head. I never found out for certain, but I had my suspicions. She described a man she'd seen around the building, someone who seemed to know too much about the tenants' comings and goings. Someone with access to the apartments who could move freely through the building without attracting attention. The description she gave matched someone I'd met briefly when I'd first come to pack my sister's things. someone who'd been helpful, sympathetic, eager to assist with the arrangements. The landlord. But even as the pieces seemed to fall into place, doubt crept in. Was I constructing a narrative that fit my need for answers? Was I so desperate to find someone to blame that I was seeing guilt where none existed? The landlord was an elderly man, soft-spoken and seemingly harmless. He'd been kind to me during this difficult time, patient with my questions, understanding about the delays in clearing out the apartment. Could he really be capable of the systematic harassment that had driven 2 women from his building? I thought about the broken electrical switches, the cupboard door that wouldn't stay closed, the windows that opened on their own. Were these really just maintenance issues, or were they something more deliberate, a way of making tenants feel unsettled, vulnerable? The more I considered it, the more plausible it seemed. The landlord had keys to all the apartments. He could enter when tenants were away, move things slightly, create an atmosphere of unease. He could install listening devices, cameras, ways of monitoring his tenants' activities. The building was old, with plenty of hiding places for such equipment. But why? What did he gain from terrorizing young women who lived alone? Maybe it wasn't about gain. Maybe it was about control, about power. Maybe he enjoyed the fear he created, the way his victims became isolated, paranoid, dependent on his reassurances that they were safe. I decided to confront him, but carefully. I called and asked to meet him at the apartment, claiming I needed help with some of my sister's belongings. He agreed readily, as I'd known he would. When he arrived, I watched him differently. The way he moved through the apartment as if he owned not just the building but everything in it. The way his eyes lingered on personal items as if he was cataloging them for future reference. The way he stood just a little too close when he spoke, invading personal space in a way that seemed calculated. I asked him about the previous tenant, the woman who'd left suddenly. His reaction was subtle but telling. A slight tightening around his eyes, a pause before he answered. He claimed not to remember much about her, said she'd been unstable, prone to paranoid fantasies. The same words he'd probably used to describe me if I accused him directly. I asked about the electrical problems, the broken cupboard door, the windows that wouldn't stay closed. He nodded sympathetically, promised to have them fixed soon, but I noticed he didn't seem surprised by any of these issues. He knew about them already. As he prepared to leave, I made a decision. I told him I'd found some things among my sister's belongings that troubled me. Photos, a journal, evidence that she'd been afraid of someone. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. For just a moment his mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes, something that confirmed my worst suspicions. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced concern. He asked what kind of evidence, whether I'd shown it to the police. His tone was casual, but I could hear the tension underneath. He was worried. I lied and told him I was planning to take everything to the detective the next day. I wanted to see how he'd react. He nodded and said that was probably wise, but as he left, I noticed he lingered in the hallway, as if listening to make sure I was alone. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the street, waiting to see if he would come back. Part of me hoped he would, that he'd do something definitive that would prove my suspicions. But part of me was terrified of what might happen if I was right. Around 3 a.m, I saw a figure moving in the shadows across the street. It was too dark to make out details, but something about the posture, the way the person moved, seemed familiar. I watched until the figure disappeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd seen anything at all. The next morning, I found that someone had been in the apartment during the night. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but I could tell. Small things were out of place. The journal I'd found was missing from where I'd hidden it. The photos were gone too. He'd been there. Somehow he'd gotten in while I was sitting by the window, watching the wrong direction. He'd taken the evidence, the proof of what he'd done to my sister. But had he, or was I losing my mind, imagining threats that didn't exist, seeing patterns in random events? I called the detective again, but without the journal and photos, I had nothing concrete to show him. My story sounded paranoid, delusional. He listened patiently, but clearly thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I packed the last of my sister's belongings and prepared to leave the apartment for the final time. As I stood in the doorway, looking back at the empty rooms, I realized I might never know the truth about what had happened here. The official story would stand. My sister had taken her own life, overwhelmed by the pressures of her situation. Case closed. But I knew better, didn't I? The switch still didn't click beneath my finger as I tried one last time to turn on the hallway light. I moved through the dim space, my footsteps absorbed by the carpet that refused to echo back. The draft lingered without a source, and the frames on the wall hung at their deliberate angles. As I reached for the door handle to leave, I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Slow, measured steps that stopped just outside the apartment. I turned, but no one was there. Just shadows and silence and the weight of questions that would never be answered. I stepped into the hallway and locked the door behind me. As I walked away, I could feel eyes watching me from somewhere in the building. But when I turned to look, I saw only empty windows and closed doors. The landlord was waiting by the front entrance, smiling his practiced smile. He asked if I'd found everything I needed, if there was anything else he could do to help. His voice was kind, concerned, but I could hear something else underneath. Satisfaction, maybe, or relief. I handed him the keys and walked away without looking back, but I could feel him watching me until I turned the corner and disappeared from view. Later, sitting in my own apartment across town, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. The evidence was gone. The witnesses were unreliable. The official story made perfect sense. But sometimes, late at night, my phone would ring and no one would be there when I answered. Sometimes I'd come home to find small things moved, rearranged just enough to notice. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a familiar figure watching from across the street. And I'd wonder if my sister's story was over, or if it was just beginning to repeat itself with a new victim. The truth, I realized, might be something I'd never fully grasp, but the questions would follow me, persistent as shadows, demanding answers I might never be able to provide. Story 5. Every morning, like church bells ringing in a far-off town, the mail slot would click at precisely 7:15 a.m. I'd listen to the soft thud of envelopes landing on the mat before I even had my coffee. It was a rhythm I relied on, a constant in a world that thrived on chaos. But last Tuesday, the slot clicked twice. 2 letters fell instead of the usual bundle. Later that week, the click came at 7:18, just slightly off, a whisper of a change. I dismissed it as coincidence until today, when there was no click at all. The mat remains bare, but outside, the street is strangely quiet. I know exactly what happened to him. The mail carrier who worked this route for 7 years vanished because he discovered something he shouldn't have. It's the only explanation that makes sense. He was methodical, reliable, the kind of person who took pride in precision. Every house on our block received their mail at the exact same time each day. He wore the same blue cap, carried the same worn leather satchel, and always nodded politely when our paths crossed. The disappearance was sudden but not mysterious. At least that's what I told myself. People leave jobs all the time. Postal workers transfer to different routes. Life happens, but I'd grown accustomed to his presence, the way you become attached to the rhythm of a grandfather clock ticking in the next room. When it stops, the silence feels deafening. I remember the morning I first noticed him, months ago. I was standing by the kitchen window, watching steam rise from my coffee mug when I saw him pause at the house across the street. He stood there longer than usual, staring at something in his hands. From my angle, I couldn't see what it was, but his body language changed. His shoulders tensed. He looked up at the house, then back down at whatever he was holding. After a moment, he walked to the front door and slipped it through the slot, but he lingered on the porch afterward, glancing around as if checking to see who might be watching. That house belonged to the woman with the red car. I'd noticed her because she kept odd hours, leaving before dawn and returning well after dark. Her curtains were always drawn, and she never seemed to collect her mail until very late in the evening. Sometimes I'd see the beam of a small flashlight moving behind those curtains, but the rooms never seemed to have proper lighting. It struck me as strange, but I minded my own business. Everyone has their routines. The mail carrier began stopping at her house differently after that day. Instead of the quick, efficient drop he made everywhere else, he would pause, sometimes rearranging the letters in his hand before approaching her door. Once I saw him take a photograph of something. He was subtle about it, using his phone while pretending to check an address, but I caught the motion from my window. I convinced myself he was being thorough, maybe documenting delivery confirmations for packages or unusual mail. Postal workers have procedures to follow, but looking back now, I realize his behavior had changed in other ways too. He started glancing over his shoulder more often. He began varying his route slightly, sometimes approaching houses from different angles, and he started carrying a small notebook, jotting things down between deliveries. The last time I saw him was exactly 2 weeks ago. It was raining lightly, and he wore a jacket I'd never seen before, dark green instead of his usual postal service windbreaker. He moved more quickly that morning, but when he reached the house with the red car, he stopped completely. He stood in the rain for what felt like several minutes, just staring at the building. Then he walked to the door, but instead of using the mail slot, he knocked. I watched from behind my kitchen curtains, curious about this break in routine. The door opened just a crack, barely wide enough for a conversation. I couldn't see who answered, but I could see him gesturing with his hands, holding up an envelope. The conversation lasted longer than it should have for a simple mail delivery. When it ended, he didn't leave the envelope. He tucked it back into his satchel and walked away. That was the last time the mail arrived at 7:15. But now, sitting here in the growing quiet of this morning, I'm starting to wonder if I had it backwards. What if he wasn't the one who discovered something dangerous? What if someone had been watching him the same way I was watching from my window? The woman with the red car hasn't been home in 3 days. I know this because the car hasn't moved from its usual spot, but no lights have appeared behind those drawn curtains. Yesterday I noticed something else. Her mailbox, which had always been stuffed with uncollected letters, was completely empty. Someone had cleared it out, but I never saw anyone approach the house. I've been thinking about that notebook he carried, wondering what he might have written in it. Postal workers see patterns that others miss. They know when people travel, when they're avoiding bills, when they're receiving unusual correspondence. They notice when someone gets too much mail or too little. They observe the kinds of details that create a map of a person's life. What if he'd been documenting something about her and she realized it? The rain from that last morning has left water stains on her driveway, dark patches that form almost like footprints leading from the street to her front door. But there are too many of them, overlapping and scattered, as if several people had walked back and forth repeatedly. When I first noticed these marks, I assumed they were just random water pooling. Now they look more deliberate, like evidence of activity I wasn't paying attention to. I've started listening for different sounds. The mail slot clicking was just one element in the morning symphony of our neighborhood. There were also car doors closing, engines starting, the soft whoosh of newspapers hitting driveways. But this week, those sounds have been off rhythm too. Cars starting at different times, footsteps on sidewalks when they shouldn't be there, the subtle creak of someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. The morning he knocked on her door instead of using the mail slot, I heard something else. After he walked away, there was another sound, a second set of footsteps, heavier and more deliberate, following the same path he'd taken. I thought it might be another resident heading to work, but when I looked out, the street was empty. I'm beginning to realize that I might not have been the only one watching. The house across the street has a clear view of my kitchen window. If I could see the mail carrier's unusual behavior, someone else could have seen me watching. They could have noticed my routine, the way I stood with my coffee every morning at the same time, observing the daily delivery. They could have realized that I was a witness to whatever was happening between him and the woman with the red car. The silence outside feels different now. It's not just the absence of mail delivery, it's the absence of normal life. The street is too clean, too orderly. Even the stray cat that used to wander between houses has disappeared. It's as if someone has carefully removed all the variables that might complicate whatever they're planning. I found something yesterday that's been bothering me. While taking out the trash, I noticed a small piece of paper caught in the hedge between my property and the neighbor's yard. It was torn from a notebook, the kind with narrow ruled lines. Written in pencil, almost too faint to read, were 3 addresses. Mine was the second one listed. The handwriting looked like his, though I'd only seen him write briefly and from a distance. But the implications of that list have been keeping me awake. Why would a mail carrier need to write down addresses he visited every day, unless he wasn't writing them down for mail delivery purposes? What if he'd been documenting something else entirely? What if the list wasn't about what he'd discovered, but about what someone had asked him to find out? Mail carriers have access to information that others don't. They know when people travel, when they're home, when they might be vulnerable. They can observe patterns of behavior that would be invisible to casual observers. The woman with the red car might not have been his target. She might have been his employer. I've been thinking about that dark green jacket he wore on the last morning. It wasn't a postal service uniform, and the weather wasn't cold enough to require extra layers, but it had pockets, more pockets than his usual clothing. The kind of jacket someone might wear if they needed to carry things they didn't want to be obvious about. Recording equipment maybe, or photographs. The conversation at her door wasn't about delivering mail. It was about delivering information. But if that's true, then what was in the envelope he showed her but didn't leave? What could have been important enough to require a face-to-face handoff instead of a simple mail slot delivery? And why did he seem so nervous about it? I keep returning to the image of him standing in the rain, staring at her house before knocking. He looked like someone working up the courage to do something they knew was dangerous, or someone who had just realized they were in over their head. The timing bothers me too. He disappeared right after that conversation, but she didn't leave until several days later. That suggests she had time to plan, time to arrange things, time to clean up whatever needed cleaning up. If he had been blackmailing her or threatening to expose something, she would have acted more quickly. But if he had been helping her and then decided to stop, she might have needed time to find another solution. The empty mailbox troubles me most of all. Mail doesn't just disappear. Someone collected it, but postal services don't clear boxes when residents are away. That's something you arrange privately, something you do when you're not planning to come back. Which means either she's gone for good, or someone else has been collecting her mail to maintain the illusion that she's still here. I realize now that I don't actually know what she looks like. In all the months I've been aware of her presence, I never saw her clearly. She was always a figure in the distance, getting into or out of the red car, moving quickly between the vehicle and her front door. I assumed she was trying to avoid social contact, but maybe she was trying to avoid being identified. The red car is still there, but I haven't checked whether the license plates are the same. Cars can be abandoned, left behind to suggest continued residence while the owner disappears entirely. Or the car could belong to someone else now, someone who wants the neighbors to believe nothing has changed. I've been wondering about my own role in this situation. If I was on that list found in my hedge, someone knows I've been watching. Someone knows I might have seen things that could be problematic later. The question is whether they see me as a threat to be eliminated or a witness to be managed. The fact that my mail has stopped arriving could be a coincidence, but coincidences feel dangerous now. Maybe the new mail carrier is simply running a different schedule, or maybe there's a deliberate reason why I'm not receiving correspondence. Mail can be intercepted, redirected, held at distribution centers. If someone wanted to isolate me from outside contact, stopping my mail would be a subtle first step. I haven't been sleeping well. Every sound outside seems significant. Footsteps on the sidewalk could be innocent pedestrians, or they could be someone checking to see if I'm still here, still following my predictable routines. Car engines starting could be neighbors heading to work, or they could be surveillance teams changing shifts. The water stains on her driveway have faded, but I can still make out the patterns if I look carefully. They don't look random anymore. They look like the kind of marks you'd see if people were carrying something heavy, something that required multiple trips and careful coordination. I keep thinking about that torn piece of notebook paper with the 3 addresses. If it came from his notebook, and if my address was on his list, then he had been watching me too. But I don't know what he might have seen or why it would have been important enough to document. Maybe I witnessed something without realizing it. Maybe in all those mornings of casual observation from my kitchen window, I saw something that could connect him to her, or her to someone else, or someone else to whatever happened to both of them. The problem is I can't tell anymore whether my memories are reliable. The more I think about those morning routines, the more details seem to shift. Was he really as punctual as I remember, or am I imposing a pattern that wasn't actually there? Did the woman with the red car really keep such odd hours, or was I simply noticing her at random times and creating a narrative around incomplete information? What if the truth is simpler and more frightening than I've been imagining? What if there was no conspiracy, no blackmail, no careful planning? What if I was just a lonely person creating stories about strangers to make my own routine feel more interesting? And now those strangers are gone for reasons that have nothing to do with me. But then why is my address on that list? And why has the entire rhythm of the neighborhood changed since they disappeared? I'm sitting here now, listening to the silence where there should be the familiar click of the mail slot, wondering if the next sound I hear will be a knock on my door. Wondering if I'll have the courage to answer it, or if I'll pretend not to be home and hope whoever it is decides to go away. The street outside looks normal in the daylight, but normal can be a carefully constructed illusion. I'm no longer certain what I actually know and what I've simply convinced myself to believe. The only thing I'm sure of is that the silence is growing deeper, and I'm running out of time to decide whether I'm a witness, a victim, or something else entirely. Story 6. The morning fog clung to the windows, blurring the world outside into a soft watercolor of gray and green. The scent of damp earth seeped in through the slightly ajar basement door, an unexpected detail in an otherwise orderly kitchen. The refrigerator hummed steadily, a comforting sound disrupted only by the gentle tapping that echoed from below. Each tap felt like a question, insistent and unanswered, drawing my eyes to the shadows gathered beneath the staircase. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unseen to step into the light. I knew then what I had been avoiding for weeks. The door had been left open deliberately. Not by me, not by accident. Someone wanted me to notice. The tapping stopped. Memory works in strange ways when you're trying to piece together the moments that led you somewhere you never intended to go. I find myself returning to that afternoon when I first noticed the basement door standing slightly open, though I'm certain I had closed it the night before. The house had felt different then, charged with an electricity I couldn't name. The kind of feeling you get when you sense someone watching you from across a crowded room, except the room was empty. Or so I thought. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its automatic timer faithfully performing the same ritual it had for months. But even that familiar sound seemed foreign now, like hearing your own voice played back on a recording. Everything in the kitchen appeared exactly as I had left it, yet nothing felt quite right. The dish towel hung at a different angle. The salt shaker had migrated 2 inches to the left. Small things, insignificant things. The kind of details that make you question your own memory. I had started keeping a notebook around then, though I can't say exactly when the idea occurred to me. The pages filled themselves with observations that seemed important at the time, but read like the ramblings of someone losing their grip on reality. Door open again this morning, checked lock twice before bed. Strange smell in kitchen like wet concrete. Heard footsteps overhead while in basement, but I live alone. That last entry troubles me most because I remember writing it, remember the certainty I felt in that moment. But I also remember standing in my bedroom directly above the basement, looking down at my own handwriting, trying to make sense of how I could have heard my own footsteps from below. The basement had always been my refuge, a workshop where I could lose myself in small projects, fixing things that weren't quite broken but weren't quite right either. The workbench held an array of tools arranged with the precision of someone who finds comfort in order. Screwdrivers lined up by size, wrenches nested together like sleeping animals. Everything in its place, everything serving a purpose. Except for the hammer. I noticed it first on a Tuesday, though the day itself holds no particular significance. The hammer sat on the far end of the bench, positioned at an angle that defied the careful organization of everything else. I reached for it, intending to return it to its proper place among the other tools, but something made me hesitate. The handle felt warm, as if someone had been gripping it moments before. The logical part of my mind offered reasonable explanations. I had used the hammer recently and simply forgotten to put it back. The warmth came from the basement's heating system. The angle was the result of careless placement during some project I couldn't quite recall. But logic felt thin in that moment, stretched like a wire under too much tension. I began to notice other things then. A coffee cup that appeared in the sink, though I distinctly remembered washing it and putting it away. Footprints in the basement dust that didn't match my shoes. The sound of water running in the pipes when all the faucets were turned off. Each incident existed in isolation, innocent enough to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. The notebook entries grew more frequent, more detailed. I found myself documenting everything. The time I heard the front door close when I was in the shower. The morning I discovered the newspaper folded differently than my usual habit. The evening the basement light was on, though I was certain I had switched it off. Reading back through these observations now, I see the progression of someone trying to build a case against their own sanity. But what if I was right to document these things? What if the alternative to madness was something far more disturbing? The tapping resumed one evening while I sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of my growing collection of notes. 3 short taps, a pause, then 3 more. It seemed to come from the basement walls themselves, as if the house was trying to communicate in its own primitive language. I followed the sound downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The basement felt different that night. Smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together while I wasn't looking. The air hung heavy with moisture and that peculiar scent of damp earth, stronger now than it had been upstairs. I stood perfectly still, listening for the tapping to resume, but heard only the steady drip of water from somewhere in the darkness beyond my workshop area. I had never explored that far corner of the basement. The previous owner had left it unfinished, and I had simply accepted it as unusable space. But standing there in the dim light of the single bulb that illuminated my workbench, I found myself drawn toward those shadows. Each step forward felt like a small act of betrayal against my own better judgment. The flashlight beam revealed nothing more threatening than concrete walls and exposed pipes. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in a space that belonged to someone else. The sensation grew stronger as I moved deeper into the basement's forgotten corners, until I felt certain that if I turned around, I would find someone standing behind me, watching my exploration with patient interest. When I did turn around, the basement was empty, but the feeling lingered. I started leaving the basement door open after that, not consciously, not as a deliberate choice, but I would find it ajar each morning despite my clear memory of closing it the night before. The ritual became part of my daily routine. Notice the open door, close it firmly, check the latch, walk away with the satisfaction of having restored order. By evening, my resolve would weaken. What harm could come from leaving it slightly open? The basement needed air circulation anyway. The truth is, I had begun to suspect that closing the door was futile. Whatever wanted access to the upper floors of my house would find a way regardless of my precautions. The open door felt less like carelessness and more like an acknowledgement of reality, a small surrender to forces I didn't understand but couldn't deny. My sleep grew restless during this period, not from fear exactly, but from a hyper-awareness that made true rest impossible. Every sound in the house demanded investigation. The settling of old wood, the expansion and contraction of pipes, the whisper of air moving through vents, all became potential evidence of an unwelcome presence. I would lie in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of my home, trying to distinguish between normal house noises and something more deliberate. The footsteps began around then, or perhaps they had always been there and I had simply learned to hear them. They came most often in the early morning hours just before dawn, when the boundary between sleep and waking becomes porous. Soft footsteps moving through the kitchen, pausing at the basement door, then descending into the darkness below. I told myself these sounds were the product of an overactive imagination, but I stopped getting up to investigate. Some truths are too heavy to carry. The notebook entries from this period make for disturbing reading. My handwriting grew less careful, my observations more fragmented. Someone cooking breakfast while I showered, smell of bacon but nothing on the stove. Found my tools rearranged, everything still there but not where I left them. Heard my own voice speaking in the basement, couldn't make out the words. That last entry stops me every time I read it. I remember writing those words, remember the absolute certainty that I had heard my own voice drifting up from the basement while I stood in the kitchen above. But I also remember being in the basement at that same time, working on a small repair, humming quietly to myself. Both memories feel equally real, equally impossible. The hammer moved again, not back to its proper place among the other tools, but to different locations around the basement. Sometimes I would find it on the floor beneath the workbench. Other times it would appear on the basement steps, as if someone had been carrying it upstairs and changed their mind halfway. Once I discovered it on the kitchen counter, its metal head leaving a small ring of condensation on the wood surface. I stopped moving it back. The hammer seemed to have developed its own sense of purpose, and I had learned not to interfere with forces beyond my understanding. Besides, there was something almost companionable about its wandering presence, like sharing the house with a restless pet that preferred to remain invisible. The basement door stood open more often now, not just slightly ajar, but wide open, as if someone wanted to ensure easy passage between the upper and lower levels of the house. The scent of damp earth grew stronger, mixing with other odors I couldn't identify. Sometimes the air carried hints of coffee brewing, though my coffee maker sat silent on the kitchen counter. Other times I detected the faint aroma of soap, as if someone had recently washed their hands in a sink I couldn't locate. I found myself spending more time in the basement, drawn by a curiosity that felt both my own and somehow foreign. The unfinished section no longer seemed threatening. Instead, it had become a place of possibility, where the normal rules of my ordered existence didn't quite apply. I would sit on the basement steps, listening to the sounds that came from the darkness beyond my workshop, no longer trying to identify their source. The tapping returned, but different now, more complex, more purposeful. It seemed to respond to my presence, growing louder when I approached, fading when I moved away. I began to think of it as a form of communication, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. Sometimes I found myself tapping back, 3 short raps against the concrete wall, waiting for a response that always came. My notebook entries grew sparse during this period, not because the strange occurrences had stopped, but because they had become so routine that documentation seemed unnecessary. The footsteps in the early morning hours were as predictable as sunrise. The rearranged tools had found new configurations that somehow made more sense than my careful organization. The voices from the basement, sometimes my own, sometimes unfamiliar, had become part of the house's natural acoustics. I realized now that I had stopped fighting against these changes and started adapting to them. The house was teaching me a new way of living, and I was proving to be a surprisingly willing student. The morning I found the second notebook, everything shifted again. It sat on my kitchen table, identical to my own journal, but filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. The entries described the same events I had been documenting, but from a different perspective. Where I had written about hearing footsteps in the basement, this other notebook recorded the experience of walking through my kitchen. Where I had noted the mysterious rearrangement of my tools, these pages described the satisfaction of organizing a workspace to better suit its intended purpose. I read through the entire notebook in one sitting, my coffee growing cold as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The entries were detailed, intimate, written by someone who clearly knew my house as well as I did. Better, perhaps, because they described rooms and spaces I had never seen, basement chambers that extended far beyond what I thought possible. The handwriting looked familiar in the way that all handwriting looks familiar when you stare at it long enough. But as I compared it to my own entries, I began to notice similarities that went beyond general penmanship. The way certain letters were formed, the pressure of the pen on paper, the rhythm of the sentences themselves. It was like looking at my own writing filtered through a distorting lens. The basement door stood wide open that morning, wider than I had ever seen it. The scent of damp earth had been replaced by something else, something that reminded me of the way air smells just before a storm. I descended the stairs slowly, carrying both notebooks, drawn by a need to understand what was happening in my own home. The basement had changed, not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to a casual observer, but in subtle shifts that spoke to someone intimately familiar with every corner and shadow. My workbench had been reorganized again, tools arranged in patterns that made perfect sense but weren't my patterns. The hammer sat in the center of it all, positioned like the focal point of some elaborate design. I set the notebooks side by side on the workbench and opened them to corresponding dates. The entries matched perfectly, two perspectives on the same events, two voices describing one shared reality. But as I read more carefully, I began to notice small discrepancies, times that didn't quite align, details that contradicted each other, emotions that seemed to belong to different people entirely. The tapping started again, but I realized now that it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from above, from the kitchen floor, from someone walking across the space I had just vacated. Someone who had waited for me to come downstairs before beginning their own exploration of my home. I climbed the stairs quietly, though I'm not sure why stealth seemed important. The kitchen was empty, exactly as I had left it, but the coffee maker was brewing a fresh pot, though I hadn't set it to start. The basement door, which I had left open behind me, was now closed. This is when I understood that the question wasn't who was sharing my house with me. The question was which one of us belonged there in the first place. The notebook I had found wasn't written by an intruder. It was written by someone who considered this their home, someone who had been documenting the strange presence of an unwelcome visitor. Someone who had been leaving the basement door open as a hint, hoping the intruder would take the suggestion and return to whatever basement they had emerged from. I looked around the kitchen with new eyes, trying to see it as a stranger might. The coffee maker that knew my schedule better than I did. The dish towel that hung at angles I didn't remember creating. The salt shaker that migrated according to preferences I didn't recall having. How long had I been the intruder in someone else's carefully ordered existence? The fog outside had lifted while I was in the basement, revealing a view I didn't quite recognize. The same trees, the same neighbor's house, but arranged in a configuration that felt subtly wrong, like looking at a photograph that had been flipped horizontally, familiar but backwards. I returned to the basement, drawn by a need to understand what I had been missing. The unfinished section called to me now with new urgency. My flashlight revealed passages I hadn't noticed before, doorways that led deeper into the earth than seemed possible. The house had been trying to show me something all along, but I had been too focused on protecting my territory to pay attention. The deeper chambers were furnished, lived in, comfortable in a way that made my upstairs existence seem temporary by comparison. A bed with sheets that smelled like my detergent. A small kitchen with appliances I recognized but had never purchased. Photographs on the walls showing a life I might have lived, people I might have known, moments I might have experienced in some other version of my story. I understood then that I had been living on the surface of something much larger. The basement wasn't just the foundation of my house, it was the foundation of a life I had forgotten I was living. The tapping hadn't been a call for help, it had been a call to come home. The hammer made perfect sense now. It belonged to the workshop downstairs, the real workshop where actual work was accomplished. My careful organization upstairs had been nothing more than a pale imitation of the purposeful arrangement I found in the basement's depths. I had been playing house while real life continued below. I spent the rest of that day exploring the basement's hidden rooms, reacquainting myself with spaces that felt both foreign and familiar. Each chamber revealed more evidence of the life I had been missing, books I remembered reading but couldn't recall owning, clothes that fit perfectly but weren't in my upstairs closet. A second notebook, this one filled with my own handwriting, documenting a completely different set of experiences. When I finally returned to the kitchen, the fog had begun to gather again outside the windows. The basement door stood open, and I realized I had no desire to close it. The scent of damp earth drifted upward, but now it smelled like home rather than intrusion. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, and I understood that it had been humming for both of us all along. I make my coffee in the basement kitchen now. The appliances work better down there, and the view from the basement windows shows a world that makes more sense than the one visible from upstairs. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the kitchen above, and I know that the other version of myself is still up there, still documenting strange occurrences, still trying to understand what's happening in what he thinks is his house. The tapping comes from upstairs now, insistent and unanswered, but I've learned not to investigate every sound. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. This morning, the fog clung to the basement windows, blurring the underground world into soft watercolor shades I had never noticed from above. The scent of damp earth filled the air, no longer unexpected but welcome, like the smell of rain after a long drought. The refrigerator hummed steadily somewhere above my head, a distant sound that belonged to someone else's story now. The gentle tapping echoed from the kitchen, each tap still feeling like a question, but one I no longer felt compelled to answer. The shadows that had once seemed threatening now gathered around me like old friends, and the air held its breath not in anticipation of something unseen stepping into the light, but in recognition that I had finally stepped into the darkness where I belonged. Story 7. Each morning I watched as the mail carrier paused at the corner, adjusting his cap with a brisk flick before heading up the street. It was an unremarkable detail, a small ritual I hadn't paid much mind to until the flick became a tug, the pause slightly longer. Yesterday he skipped the adjustment altogether, a subtle lapse in his usual routine. This morning I noticed the cap was askew, his steps faltering. The letterbox felt unusually empty today, and I'm almost certain I left it closed. The kitchen window provides the perfect frame for this daily theater. Its glass bears the ghostly impressions of countless mornings, my breath fogging the surface as I lean forward with coffee in hand. The window latch has grown loose over time, requiring an extra push to secure it properly. Sometimes I wonder if I've been pushing hard enough. The condensation patterns seem different lately, as though someone else has been breathing against this same pane of glass. When I wipe it clean, my reflection stares back with an expression I don't quite recognize. My coffee mug holds the weight of routine, its ceramic surface worn smooth by years of the same grip, the same position between my palms. The handle bears a hairline crack that wasn't there before, or perhaps I simply never noticed it until now. The coffee tastes slightly bitter this morning, though I used the same beans, the same measure of grounds. The dregs at the bottom form patterns that remind me of roads or veins, or the delicate tracery of something breaking apart from within. The newspaper usually arrives with a satisfying thud against the front door, but today it rests neatly folded on the welcome mat. No sound preceded its appearance. The delivery person must have placed it there with unusual care, or perhaps I was distracted and missed the familiar impact. The headlines blur together in my peripheral vision, words about investigations and missing persons that I choose not to read too closely. The print leaves faint smudges on my fingertips, darker than usual, as though the ink hasn't quite dried. My neighbor's garden gnome has shifted position again. It faces my house now, its painted smile somehow more pronounced in the morning light. The figurine used to guard their roses, but now it stands sentinel near the property line, its ceramic eyes fixed on my front door. I've never seen anyone move it, yet its location changes with the subtle persistence of seasons. The paint on its pointed hat has begun to chip, revealing the gray clay beneath, like skin beneath a wound. The mailbox key turns with more resistance than it should. The metal has grown cold despite the warming weather, and the lock mechanism seems to catch on something invisible. Inside, the space echoes with emptiness, though I'm certain there should be bills, advertisements, the usual debris of daily life. The interior walls bear scratches I don't remember seeing before, thin lines that could be the result of hasty retrieval or something else entirely. My fingers come away with a fine coating of metallic dust. The hallway mirror reflects the morning light at an angle that creates shadows where none should exist. The glass surface ripples slightly when I pass, as though responding to some imperceptible vibration. My reflection appears fragmented, divided by what might be natural distortions in the old mirror or something more deliberate. The frame has loosened, allowing the mirror to shift within its mounting, creating an unsettling mobility that makes me question what I'm actually seeing. The telephone in the living room maintains its silence with an almost aggressive quality. The receiver feels heavier when I lift it to check for a dial tone, and the plastic has grown warm as though recently used. No messages wait on the answering machine, yet the red light blinks with mechanical persistence. The cord has developed a new twist, a spiral that suggests someone has been pacing while holding the phone, turning in circles with nervous energy. My reading chair holds the impression of a different posture, the cushions compressed in a pattern that doesn't match my usual way of sitting. The armrests show wear marks in unfamiliar places, and the fabric has begun to pill in spots I rarely touch. The book I left open on the side table has closed itself, the bookmark relocated to a page I haven't reached yet. The words on that page speak of surveillance and paranoia, themes that seem too coincidental for comfort. The basement door stands slightly ajar, though I maintain a habit of keeping it firmly closed. The hinges produce no sound when I push it shut, as though someone has recently oiled them for silence. The darkness beyond seems deeper than usual, more substantial, as though it has weight and intention. Cool air rises from below, carrying scents of earth and something else, something that reminds me of fear or excitement, with a metallic taste of blood in my mouth when I bite my tongue. The photograph on the mantelpiece has shifted within its frame. The subjects seem to occupy different positions relative to the borders, as though the image has been cropped and reprinted. The faces appear more distant, their expressions harder to read in the changing light. The glass protecting the photograph bears a single fingerprint that doesn't match my own, its whorls and ridges creating a pattern I find myself studying with uncomfortable fascination. The kitchen drawer that holds the knives slides open with unusual ease. The blades rest in their wooden block with gaps I don't remember seeing before, spaces that suggest missing pieces or simply a rearrangement I failed to notice. The largest knife bears water spots despite my certainty that I dried it thoroughly after the last use. The metal reflects the overhead light in fragments, creating a kaleidoscope of brightness that hurts to look at directly. My bedroom closet exhales the scent of unfamiliar fabric softener when I open its doors. The clothes hang in slightly different arrangements, sleeves touching that previously hung apart, gaps where items should be. The floor bears the impression of shoes that aren't mine, or perhaps my own shoes worn by feet that don't quite match my gait. The darkness at the back of the closet seems to extend beyond the actual dimensions of the space. The bathroom medicine cabinet mirror swings open at the slightest touch, revealing shelves that echo with emptiness despite the bottles and boxes arranged there. The prescription labels have begun to fade, making the names and dosages difficult to read. Some of the bottles rattle with pills I don't remember taking, while others that should be full feel suspiciously light. The mirror's reflection shows my face from an angle that makes my features appear asymmetrical, foreign. The living room carpet bears the indentations of furniture that has been moved and replaced, not quite perfectly aligned with the original positions. The pattern in the weave seems to flow differently in the morning light, creating optical illusions that make the floor appear to undulate gently. Dust motes dance in the air above these impressions, following currents that suggest recent disturbance, the invisible aftermath of careful rearrangement. The front door lock shows scratches around the keyhole, fine lines that could indicate repeated attempts at entry or simply the natural wear of daily use. The deadbolt turns with a different sound than before, a softer click that lacks the authoritative finality I remember. The wood around the lock has begun to split in hairline fractures, as though subjected to pressure or repeated stress. The peephole lens has clouded slightly, making the outside world appear dreamlike and distorted. The garage door opener responds to commands with a hesitation that wasn't there before. The motor runs for an extra second after the door has stopped moving, as though uncertain of its task. The concrete floor bears tire tracks that don't quite match my car's tread pattern, or perhaps the same treads worn down in unfamiliar ways. Oil stains have appeared in new locations, dark spots that glisten with recent moisture. The garden hose coils differently than I left it, its curves forming patterns that seem almost deliberate in their geometry. The nozzle points toward the house now, its brass fitting bright with recent polishing. Water pressure has decreased noticeably, suggesting blockages or diversions somewhere in the system. The ground around the spigot shows signs of recent digging, small disturbances in the soil that could be the work of animals or something more purposeful. The mailbox post has developed a slight line, tilting toward the street as though drawn by some invisible force. The metal has begun to show rust in places that should be protected from moisture, orange blooms that spread like infection through the paint. The house numbers have faded unevenly, some digits clearer than others, creating an address that seems to shift depending on the angle of observation. The flag that indicates outgoing mail hangs at half-mast, though I'm certain I left it down. Story 8. The clock chimed once, yet it echoed twice in my ear. The smell of morning coffee lingered, yet the pot was cold, untouched. I shuffled the papers on the desk, their edges misaligned, despite my nightly ritual of perfecting the stack. The vase on the mantelpiece stood a fraction to the left, though I remembered centering it. My hands, unsteady, traced the air where the dust no longer settled. I watched as the curtains swayed slightly, pulled by an unfelt breeze, and yet the windows remained closed. An echo of my footsteps resounded, one step too many in the empty room. Something remained behind unseen, insisting that it had moved before I did. The neighbor's dog stopped barking that morning. I noticed because silence has weight pressing against the walls of routine. For months, the animal had marked dawn with its persistent howling, a sound I'd grown to expect, even depend upon. Now the absence carved itself into my awareness like a missing tooth my tongue couldn't stop probing. I found myself standing at the kitchen window longer than necessary, watching the house across the way. The blue sedan wasn't in the driveway. It had been there every morning for weeks, parked at the same angle, license plate facing away from my view. The absence felt deliberate, calculated. My coffee grew cold while I watched. The steam stopped rising from the cup, and still I stood there, waiting for something that wouldn't come. The phone rang twice that week, both times silence on the other end, then the soft click of disconnection. Not hang-ups exactly, but pauses filled with the weight of someone listening, measuring my breathing against their own. I began to recognize the quality of that silence, the way it seemed to press against my ear with familiar intimacy. I started keeping notes, small observations written on torn pieces of paper, tucked into my jacket pocket, the grocery clerk who avoided eye contact, the mailman who walked past my house without stopping, though I watched him deliver to every other address on the street, the way shadows seemed to linger in doorways after people had passed. The notes accumulated. I spread them across the dining table like evidence of something I couldn't yet name. Patterns emerged, then dissolved when I tried to focus on them directly, like trying to see stars by looking straight at them instead of catching them in peripheral vision. I remember the first time I saw the figure in the park, not clearly, never clearly. A shape that might have been a person sitting on the bench near the fountain, always there when I glanced over, gone when I looked directly. I started timing my walks differently, approaching from various angles, but the pattern held, present in my peripheral awareness, absent under scrutiny. The hardware store clerk asked if I was having trouble with my locks. I'd been there 3 times that week, buying deadbolts, chain guards, window latches. My hands shook slightly as I counted out exact change, and he noticed. His question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. That night I installed the new locks. The sound of the drill seemed too loud, echoing through the house with mechanical violence. I found myself pausing between holes, listening for something underneath the noise. A footstep, a breath, the creak of floorboards settling under weight that shouldn't be there. The work took longer than expected. I kept checking the windows, drawn by movements that resolved into nothing when investigated. Tree branches swaying in wind I couldn't feel. Shadows shifting without corresponding changes in light. My attention fractured, scattered across a dozen small anxieties that buzzed beneath my skin like static electricity. I discovered the first envelope on a morning when frost covered the lawn in crystalline patterns. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in careful block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside, a single photograph, my house, taken from across the street, showing me standing at the kitchen window. The angle suggested someone had been watching from the empty lot where children used to play before the city declared it unsafe. The photograph was dated, though I couldn't remember posing for it, couldn't recall standing in exactly that position with that particular expression of concentration on my face. Yet there I was, captured in a moment that felt both foreign and intimate, like seeing yourself in a dream you don't remember having. I kept the photograph in my wallet, checking it periodically throughout the day. The image seemed to change subtly each time I looked, though I knew that was impossible. Sometimes my expression appeared more worried, sometimes more resigned. The lighting shifted, casting different shadows across my face, suggesting different times of day despite the timestamp in the corner. The second envelope arrived while I was at work. I found it wedged between the screen door and the frame, positioned so I would notice it immediately upon returning home. This one contained a receipt from the hardware store, circled in red ink. Not one of my receipts, but someone else's purchase from the same day I'd bought the locks. Cable ties, duct tape, a utility knife. Items that formed a constellation of possibility in my mind, none of it reassuring. I began varying my routine. Different routes to work, irregular lunch hours, random stops at unfamiliar stores. But the feeling of observation persisted, adapting to my changes like water finding its level. If anything, the unpredictability seemed to intensify the sensation of being watched, as if my evasive maneuvers had become part of the game. The dreams started around then, not nightmares exactly, but scenarios that felt too detailed to be imagination. I would find myself walking through my house in darkness, guided by familiarity, only to discover rooms I'd never seen before. Hallways that stretched longer than the architecture allowed, doors that opened onto spaces that couldn't exist within the structure I knew. In these dreams, I was always searching for something, though I could never remember what. My hands would move with purpose, opening drawers, lifting cushions, checking behind picture frames. The urgency felt real, pressing, but the object of my search remained maddeningly elusive. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth, my fingertips sensitive as if I'd actually been touching unfamiliar surfaces. Sometimes I found dirt under my nails, though I couldn't account for how it had gotten there. The pattern of the envelopes became clear after the fifth one arrived, always on days when I deviated from routine, always containing evidence of my movements. A parking receipt from the mall I'd visited impulsively, a photograph of me entering the library at an unusual hour, a copy of my credit card signature from the restaurant where I'd eaten lunch alone, trying to lose myself in the anonymity of crowds. Someone was documenting my attempts at unpredictability, creating a record of my evasions. The surveillance had become collaborative, my actions generating the very evidence being used to prove its existence. I was participating in my own observation, feeding information to someone whose identity remained stubbornly opaque. I stopped opening the envelopes. They accumulated on the kitchen counter, a growing stack of unopened communications that seemed to pulse with potential energy. But knowing they were there, sealed and waiting, created its own form of tension. The unknown contents pressed against my awareness like physical weight. The night I finally opened them all at once, spreading their contents across the living room floor, I discovered the scope of the documentation. Months of my life reduced to receipts, photographs, and handwritten observations. My habits cataloged with scientific precision. My preferences noted and analyzed. The mundane details of my existence transformed into data points in someone else's investigation. But investigation of what? The questions circled through my thoughts without finding purchase. I was simultaneously the subject and the mystery, the observed and the observer trying to understand the nature of the observation. I found myself studying the handwriting on the envelopes, looking for clues in the formation of letters, the pressure of the pen against paper. The script was careful, controlled, suggesting someone who took time with details. But it was also familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten with recognition I couldn't quite place. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over landscape I thought I knew. The handwriting wasn't foreign at all. The careful block letters, the specific way certain vowels were formed, the slight rightward slant of the vertical strokes. I'd been looking at my own penmanship, perfected through years of practice, refined through countless repetitions. I checked my desk drawer, comparing the envelopes to samples of my own writing. The match was undeniable, though I had no memory of creating any of the documentation spread across my floor. The photographs, the receipts, the detailed observations of my own behavior, all cataloged in my own meticulous hand. The missing time began to make sense then. The mornings when I woke feeling unrested despite a full night's sleep. The evenings when I found myself standing in rooms without remembering walking there. The small displacements I'd attributed to forgetfulness or stress. Someone had been moving through my life, using my body, documenting my existence with clinical detachment. But if that someone was me, then who was I when I wasn't being me? The question followed me through the following days like a shadow that had learned to cast itself. I began leaving myself notes, trying to communicate across the gap in my awareness. Simple messages placed where I would find them, asking questions about the surveillance, the documentation, the purpose behind the elaborate self-observation. The responses came in my own handwriting, but the voice was different, more analytical, less emotional. The other version of me seemed to view my confusion with detached interest, as if I were a subject in an experiment rather than a collaborator in shared consciousness. According to the notes, the observation had begun as a form of protection. Someone had been watching me, and the only way to understand the threat was to watch myself more carefully than they could. But the surveillance had evolved, becoming its own purpose, generating data that revealed patterns I hadn't known existed in my own behavior. The other me had discovered things, inconsistencies in my memory, gaps in my timeline that suggested periods of unconsciousness or dissociation. Evidence of activities I couldn't recall, places I'd been without knowing I'd gone there. The documentation was an attempt to map the territory of my own existence, to understand who I was when I wasn't paying attention to being myself. But the investigation had revealed more questions than answers. The gaps in my memory corresponded to moments when someone else had been active in my life, making decisions, taking actions, creating consequences I would later discover without understanding their origin. The other me was trying to solve the mystery of my own multiplicity, using surveillance techniques to track the various versions of myself through time. I began to recognize the signs of transition, the slight disorientation upon waking, the sense that objects in my house had been moved by careful hands, the feeling of resuming a conversation I didn't remember starting. Someone was living my life in shifts, and we were all trying to understand who the others were. The photographs revealed the truth in fragments, images of me taken from impossible angles, showing expressions I didn't recognize as my own. My face wearing unfamiliar emotions, my body positioned in ways that suggested different personalities inhabiting the same physical space. The camera had captured what mirrors couldn't show, the evidence of internal multiplicity made visible. I started setting up my own surveillance system, cameras positioned to record my movements during the periods when my memory went dark. The footage revealed a stranger wearing my face, moving through my house with purposeful efficiency, organizing my possessions according to systems I didn't understand, creating order from chaos I couldn't see. This other version of me worked with methodical precision, sorting through papers, arranging objects, cleaning surfaces that already appeared clean. But the movements were different from my own, more economical, suggesting someone who understood the space differently than I did. Someone who saw patterns where I saw randomness, who found meaning in arrangements that appeared arbitrary to my conscious mind. The recordings showed me having conversations with people who weren't visible in the frame. Long discussions conducted in my voice, but with inflections I didn't recognize. Sometimes I appeared to be listening intently to responses I couldn't hear, nodding in agreement with statements that existed only in the space between what the camera could capture and what my conscious mind could remember. I began leaving the camera running continuously, trying to document the transitions between versions of myself. The footage revealed moments of stillness so complete they resembled death, followed by sudden animation as a different personality assumed control. But the changes were seamless, suggesting not conflict but collaboration between the various aspects of my identity. The most disturbing recordings showed me preparing for activities I would never remember undertaking. Gathering supplies, studying maps, practicing movements with repetitive precision. The other me was planning something, using resources and knowledge I didn't know I possessed, working toward goals that remained opaque to my conscious awareness. I tried confronting this other version directly, staying awake for days at a time, fighting the transition periods with caffeine and willpower. But exhaustion eventually claimed me, and I would wake to find new evidence of activity I couldn't recall. Notes written in my handwriting, describing conversations I'd never had, plans I'd never made, observations about people I'd never met. The boundary between observer and observed had dissolved completely. I was watching myself watch myself, creating an infinite regression of surveillance that generated more questions with each layer of documentation. The mystery I'd been trying to solve had become the method of investigation itself. The final envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a message that stopped my breathing. We need to meet. The handwriting was mine, but the signature was different, more confident, suggesting someone who had accepted what I was still struggling to understand. The meeting place was specified as the park where I'd first noticed the figure on the bench. The time was set for the moment when day transitions into evening, when shadows grow long enough to hide the seams between different versions of reality. I arrived early, positioning myself where I could observe the bench while remaining hidden. The figure appeared exactly on schedule, walking with my gait but carrying itself differently, more upright, more purposeful. It was me, but not me, wearing my face like a mask that had learned to express unfamiliar emotions. We sat on opposite ends of the bench, two versions of the same person trying to understand how we had become plural. The conversation that followed existed in the space between speech and silence, conducted through glances and gestures that carried more meaning than words could contain. The other me explained that the surveillance had been necessary because something had been hunting us, tracking our movements with predatory patience. The only way to stay ahead of the threat was to know ourselves better than it knew us, to map our patterns before they could be used against us. But the investigation had revealed that the hunter and the hunted were the same person, that the threat we'd been fleeing was the very multiplicity we developed as protection. We were both predator and prey, observer and observed, the mystery and its own solution. The sun set while we sat there, neither version of me willing to be the first to leave. The park grew dark around us, and I began to understand that this meeting wasn't an ending but a recognition. We had always been multiple, had always been watching ourselves from angles we couldn't see, had always been living lives that intersected in ways too complex for singular consciousness to comprehend. When I finally returned home, I found the surveillance equipment had been dismantled, the cameras removed, the documentation filed away in drawers I didn't remember organizing. The house felt different, more spacious, as if internal walls had been removed to create rooms large enough for multiple occupants. I still find evidence of the others sometimes. A book open to a page I didn't mark, a cup of coffee still warm though I don't remember making it, footprints in the garden leading to places I haven't been. But the fear has been replaced by curiosity, the anxiety transformed into acceptance of complexity I'm only beginning to understand. The clock still chimes once and echoes twice, but now I recognize the second sound as my own voice, answering from a place I haven't learned to visit consciously. The coffee pot remains cold because someone else drinks from a different cup, in a different kitchen that occupies the same space as mine. The papers on my desk align themselves according to systems I'm still learning to read, organized by hands that know things my conscious mind hasn't discovered yet. Story 9. The morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn, rustling leaves that whispered secrets along the pavement. A steady hum from the nearby street was punctuated by the familiar creak of a neglected gate. Inside the quiet home, the grandfather clock ticked rhythmically, a comforting metronome against the silence. Yet in the living room, a single chair was askew, slightly out of line from the others circling the hearth. Nearby, the mantel clock had stopped, hands frozen at a time that contradicted the rest. A quiet unease lingered, like a held breath waiting to exhale. I can't shake this feeling in my stomach. It sits there like a stone, cold and heavy, pressing against my ribs every time I breathe. The nausea comes in waves, unpredictable as tide pools, and I find myself gripping the kitchen counter until my knuckles turn white. Something happened here. Something I can't quite grasp, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. The chair, why do I keep thinking about that chair? It was her favorite spot, wasn't it? The way the afternoon light would catch the dust motes dancing around her silver hair. She always sat with her back perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for instruction. But the chair is wrong now, turned at an angle that makes my teeth ache when I look at it. Memory is a liar. I know this now, the way you know the taste of copper when you bite your tongue. It whispers half-truths and paints over the cracks with colors that never existed. But the feeling remains constant, this sick twist in my gut that tells me something fundamental shifted in that room. I remember the sound of breaking glass, though I can't place when it happened. Sharp and sudden, like a bird hitting a window, or was it a window breaking? The fragments scattered across the hardwood floor, catching light like tiny stars. I swept them up, didn't I? My hands shaking as I worked, careful not to cut myself on the edges of whatever had shattered. But what broke? The mantel clock stopped at 10:47. I know this because I've stared at those frozen hands until they burned themselves into my vision. 10:47 in the morning or evening. The light was wrong for either time, slanting through the windows at an impossible angle. Nothing made sense that day, if it was even day at all. She was wearing her blue sweater, the one with the small hole near the left elbow that she refused to mend. Said it gave the garment character. Her voice had a tremor in it, barely noticeable unless you knew to listen for it. I knew to listen. I'd been listening for weeks, months maybe, waiting for something to crack. The waiting, that's what I remember most clearly. Sitting in rooms filled with unspoken words, watching her fingers trace patterns on the armrest of that chair. Always the same chair, always the same position, until it wasn't. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks wrong. Eyes too wide, pupils dilated like I've been staring into bright lights. I splash cold water on my face, but the feeling doesn't wash away. It clings to my skin like humidity, making everything feel damp and close. There was a conversation, fragments of its surface like debris after a storm. Her voice, thin and reedy, asking questions I couldn't answer, or wouldn't answer. The distinction blurs when I try to focus on it. Words about trust, about family, about things that should have stayed buried. You never understood, she said, or maybe I said it. The memory shifts depending on how I approach it, like looking at something from the corner of your eye. The grandfather clock kept ticking through it all, that steady rhythm that should have been comforting but felt instead like a countdown. Tick, 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 each second falling away like sand through an hourglass, time moving forward while everything else stood still. I found the letters in the drawer of her writing desk, yellow with age, tied with a ribbon that crumbled when I touched it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, though the signature made my chest tighten. Someone I thought I knew, someone I thought I could trust. Lies have a particular weight to them. They sit differently in your mouth, taste different when you swallow them. I'd been swallowing lies for so long I'd forgotten what truth felt like. But holding those letters, reading words that rewrote everything I thought I understood, the taste came flooding back. Bitter truth tastes bitter. The chair moved by itself, or so it seemed. One moment aligned with the others, the next turned at that wrong angle. I stared at it until my eyes watered, trying to remember the exact moment it shifted. But memory is unreliable, especially when you need it most. She was crying or laughing. The sound was the same from where I stood in the doorway, watching her shoulders shake. The blue sweater rising and falling with each breath, that hole near the elbow dark as a wound. "I'm sorry," someone said. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back once released. Sorry for what? For reading the letters, for asking questions, for not asking them sooner. The broken glass belonged to the picture frame. I remember now, though the memory feels borrowed from someone else's experience. Her wedding photograph, the one that sat on the side table for decades. The glass spiderwebbed from impact, dividing her young face into fragments. But I didn't break it, did I? My hands are steady now as I write this, but they weren't steady then. Everything shook. My hands, my voice, my understanding of what was real and what was constructed from years of careful omissions. The truth has a way of making everything unstable, like pulling the wrong thread from a tapestry. The clock stopped during our conversation. I'm certain of this, though certainty feels like a luxury I can no longer afford. One moment the hands were moving, marking time in their eternal circle. The next they were frozen. 10:47, forever. She stood up from the chair. This I remember with crystalline clarity. The way she rose with that careful dignity she'd maintained even as everything else crumbled. The chair rocked slightly from the movement, settling at that odd angle that still makes my stomach clench. "You don't know what you've done," she said, or perhaps whispered. The words carried weight beyond their simple construction, heavy with implications I couldn't fully grasp. But I was beginning to understand. The letters revealed a different version of the story I'd been told my entire life. Names I didn't recognize connected to events that shaped everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself. Each page turned reality a little more inside out until I wasn't sure which way was up. The nausea returns when I think about what came next, not the events themselves, which remain frustratingly unclear, but the feeling of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Some knowledge changes you in ways that can't be undone. I swept up the glass from the broken frame, each shard a small mirror reflecting distorted pieces of the room. The photograph itself was undamaged, her young face smiling up at me with secrets I was only beginning to comprehend. I should have left it broken. Some things are meant to stay fractured. The silence that followed was different from the quiet that came before, heavier, more final. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed impossibly loud in comparison, each second a small explosion in the stillness. She was gone when I looked up from the glass. The chair sat empty, turned at that wrong angle, still warm from her presence. I called out, but my voice echoed strangely in the house, as if the walls had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I found her in the garden, though finding implies I was looking. Perhaps I simply followed the path of least resistance, drawn by something I couldn't name. She was kneeling among the flowers, her hands dark with soil, the blue sweater stretched tight across her shoulders. "The roses need tending," she said without looking up, as if nothing had happened, as if the letters weren't still scattered across the living room floor, their secrets exposed to the afternoon light. But everything had changed. The quality of the air, the way shadows fell, the sound of my own breathing. Knowledge is a virus that infects everything it touches, and I was thoroughly contaminated. I helped her to her feet, noting how light she felt, as if the revelations had somehow diminished her physical presence. We walked back to the house together, neither of us speaking, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like an approaching storm. The chair was upright when we returned, perfectly aligned with the others, as if it had never been disturbed. I stared at it, my mind struggling to reconcile what I remembered with what I saw. Memory and reality seemed to be operating by different rules. She settled back into her spot, hands folded in her lap, that small hole in her sweater dark against the blue fabric. The mantel clock remained frozen at 10:47, a monument to the moment everything stopped making sense. Some stories, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, are better left untold. But it was too late for that. The letters had been read, the questions asked, the comfortable lies exposed to harsh light. We sat in our respective chairs, the circle around the hearth complete but somehow broken, waiting for something that might never come. The grandfather clock continued its relentless counting, marking time that felt increasingly meaningless. Tick, 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 each second carrying us further from what we'd been and closer to something undefined. I should have put the letters back in the drawer, should have retied the crumbling ribbon and pretended I'd never found them. But curiosity is a hunger that feeds on itself, growing stronger with each small satisfaction. Now I sit here, the taste of truth still bitter on my tongue, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. The chair remains perfectly positioned, though something about its placement still feels wrong. The mantel clock's hands point accusingly at 10:47, time frozen at the moment everything changed. She sleeps in her chair now, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. The blue sweater rises and falls with each breath, that small hole near the elbow dark as a secret. I should wake her, suggest she'd be more comfortable in bed, but something holds me back. The broken picture frame lies in the trash, its glass fragments wrapped carefully in newspaper. But the photograph sits on my desk now, her young face staring up at me with eyes that hold knowledge I'm only beginning to understand. Some secrets are inherited, passed down like genetic traits, waiting for the right moment to surface. The nausea hasn't left. If anything, it's grown stronger, more insistent. My body knows something my mind hasn't fully accepted yet. Truth has its own gravity, pulling everything toward a center that might not hold. I close my eyes and listen to the grandfather clock's steady rhythm, trying to find comfort in its consistency. But even that feels different now, less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown. Time moving forward while everything else remains suspended, waiting for resolution that may never come. When I open my eyes, the chair is empty. Story 10. The entrance was recorded as unguarded at the time of inspection. All windows and secondary access points maintained their intact status, with no visible tampering or forced entry. An unopened sandwich remained on the kitchen counter, dated and stamped with the previous day's mark. Surveillance footage indicated zero activity post-closure, yet the security system registered a silent alert at 03:17 a.m., unacknowledged until the following morning's review. The storage room inventory was complete, with serial numbers matching existing records. However, an extra chair was situated in the corner, absent from the original floor plan. I knew exactly what had happened that night. The facts were clear, laid out like pieces of a puzzle that fit together perfectly. Someone had been inside the building after closing, despite what the cameras showed. They brought their own chair, sat in that storage room for hours, then vanished without leaving any other trace. It was methodical, planned, professional even. The sandwich told the whole story. turkey and Swiss on wheat bread, still wrapped in its plastic container from the deli downstairs. The employee who'd left it had been interrupted, called away suddenly before they could eat. That much was obvious from the way it sat there, positioned exactly where someone would place it if they intended to return. The timestamp confirmed it, purchased at 4:30 the previous afternoon, right before closing. What struck me as brilliant was the simplicity of it. No broken glass, no jimmied locks, no alarms screaming in the night. Just that single, silent alert at 3:17 in the morning. The kind of alert that gets buried in daily reports, overlooked by tired security guards reviewing footage over coffee and donuts. Whoever did this understood systems, understood how people think, how they overlook the subtle in favor of the obvious. The chair bothered everyone else, but not me. I saw it for what it was, proof of patience. Someone had sat in that corner for hours, watching, waiting. The positioning was perfect, far enough from the main walkway to avoid the motion sensors, angled to provide a clear view of both the entrance and the main corridor. It spoke to reconnaissance, to planning that went far deeper than a simple break-in. I walked through that building dozens of times in the following days, retracing what I believed had happened. The intruder had entered through the service corridor, the one blind spot in the camera coverage that everyone knew about but nobody had bothered to fix. They'd moved carefully, deliberately, bringing only what they needed. The chair, perhaps a small bag with water, something to eat. They'd settled in to wait. But wait for what? That's where my certainty began to crack. The more I studied the surveillance footage, the more questions emerged. The timestamp on the sandwich seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. And the deli downstairs, I'd checked their security footage too. The employee who'd supposedly purchased that sandwich didn't appear on any of their cameras that afternoon. In fact, according to their records, no one from the building had bought anything that day. I found myself returning to that storage room, staring at the corner where the chair had been. The building felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. The air conditioning hummed with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, and the fluorescent lights cast shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Small things, probably nothing, but they accumulated like dust in corners, impossible to ignore once you noticed them. The sandwich had been moved, just slightly, maybe an inch to the left from where I remembered it. When I mentioned this to the security chief, he gave me a look that suggested I was seeing things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd observed. I'd photographed that counter from every angle, measured distances, noted the exact position of every item. The sandwich had moved. That's when I started questioning the timeline. If someone had been in the building that night, sitting in that chair, watching and waiting, what had they seen? The employee who'd left the sandwich, had they really left it there accidentally? Or had they been interrupted by something else, someone else already in the building? I pulled the employment records, cross-referenced them with the building's access logs. The employee who'd supposedly left that sandwich had badged out at exactly 5:15 that afternoon, 37 minutes after the deli claimed to have sold it to them. But the deli's footage showed no one from our building making any purchases after 4 o'clock. The mathematics didn't work. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake reconstructing that evening, trying to make sense of the contradictions. The building's ventilation system cycled every 20 minutes, a soft whoosh of air that I'd never noticed before. Now it seemed to punctuate my thoughts, marking time like a metronome. In the darkness, I found myself counting the cycles, using them to measure the gaps in my understanding. The chair haunted me most. I'd assumed it belonged to the intruder, but what if I'd been wrong? What if it had been there all along, part of some configuration that the original floor plan had failed to document? Old buildings accumulate furniture like sediment, chairs and tables migrating from office to office, floor to floor, until their origins become untraceable. I started arriving at work early, staying late, trying to catch the building in its natural state. The morning cleaning crew knew me by sight now, nodding as they emptied trash cans and mopped floors. They moved through the space with practiced efficiency, following routes that had been optimized over months or years. They knew every corner, every hidden alcove. When I asked about the storage room, the night supervisor paused in her work. She'd been cleaning this building for 8 years, she told me. That chair had been in that corner for at least 6 months, maybe longer. She dusted it weekly, moved it to vacuum underneath. It wasn't new. It wasn't evidence of an intrusion. The certainty I'd felt began to dissolve like sugar in rain. If the chair had been there all along, if the sandwich's provenance was questionable, if the timeline didn't align, then what had really happened that night? The silent alarm remained unexplained, but now it seemed less like evidence of a break-in and more like a glitch, a system hiccup that had triggered an investigation into nothing. But something had happened. I could feel it in the way the building seemed to hold its breath during the quiet hours between shifts, the way shadows fell differently in that storage room, the way the air itself seemed thicker, more resistant, as if it carried the weight of unspoken secrets. I began to suspect that I'd been looking at this backwards. Instead of someone breaking in, what if someone had been trying to break out? The thought arrived fully formed, accompanied by a chill that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. What if the person in that chair hadn't been an intruder but a prisoner? The building's history became my obsession. I researched its previous tenants, its original construction, any incidents that might have been forgotten or deliberately overlooked. The records were frustratingly incomplete, full of gaps and inconsistencies that mirrored my own investigation. Previous security reports mentioned minor anomalies going back years, unexplained temperature fluctuations, electrical issues that resolved themselves, the occasional report of sounds with no identifiable source. Each discovery made me question not just what had happened that night, but what was continuing to happen. The building felt alive in ways that architecture shouldn't. Doors that I remembered closing would be found open. The elevator would arrive at floors where no one had called it. Small things easily dismissed as mechanical quirks or human error. The sandwich had disappeared entirely now. No one remembered removing it, but the counter was clean, empty except for the usual office detritus of coffee rings and scattered paperwork. When I asked about it, people looked at me with the kind of polite concern usually reserved for those who'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd become so invested in finding answers that I'd started inventing mysteries where none existed. The human mind seeks patterns, creates narratives from random events. It's possible that everything I'd observed was simply the result of confirmation bias, of wanting so desperately to solve a puzzle that I'd constructed one from unrelated pieces. But late at night, when the building settled into its quiet rhythms, I could feel the weight of that chair in the storage room corner. Even though it had always been there, even though it meant nothing, it seemed to anchor something invisible, something that existed in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The investigation officially closed with no findings of criminal activity. The silent alarm was attributed to a sensor malfunction that had since been repaired. The building returned to its normal operations, and life moved forward with the steady predictability of routine. Yet I find myself returning to that storage room, drawn by questions that have no answers. The chair sits in its corner, patient and unremarkable, holding secrets that may exist only in my imagination. The building breathes around me, its mechanical lungs cycling air that carries the faint scent of something I can't identify, something that might be memory or might be fear. I no longer know what I believe happened that night. The facts have become fluid, shifting like shadows cast by fluorescent lights. What I thought I knew with certainty has dissolved into possibility, into the recognition that truth might be less important than the search for it. The building keeps its secrets, and I keep searching, knowing that some questions are more valuable than their answers, some mysteries more revealing than their solutions.